All right, people. What's happening? How's everyone doing tonight? I have this sweet setup that I hooked up today where I'm going to be able to control my slides, my presentation slides with my iPhone. It's pretty dope. So I don't have to sit up like this and put my face into yours every time I want to change the slides. Good evening, everybody. I think tonight we're going to cut the shit and we're going to get straight after it. So, allow me to put on the big display. There we are. All right. So, let me know if the audio and the video are out of sync at any time, or if there are any technical glitches. Just give me a shout in the chat. I am watching the chat, but as I have been doing lately, I'm going to try to kind of ignore the chat for most of it. If something really catches my attention, maybe I'll pause to engage, but if I look at the chat too much, then it's going to be very choppy lecture. So with that as a bit of a caveat, I think now we'll get right into this talk. A little bit of background, though, very briefly, on the motivation behind this talk and where it's all coming from. And also a little bit about the nature of the talk. I actually put a little bit more effort into this talk, tried to kind of map something out in a little bit more detail, give it some forethought. I actually wrote a blog post today, spent the better part of today writing this out, kind of getting out my major thoughts in words first, and then putting together some nice slides for you. In large part because this was suggested to me by a patron, actually, and he floated to me a bunch of ideas, a bunch of kind of related themes, if you will, and was really kind of urging me to talk about this at greater length. So I kind of listened to his thoughts and then did some reflecting on my own thoughts and some of the kind of half-started essays and half-formed thoughts that I had lying around my own head and hard drive. And this is what I came up with. So yeah, this talk, which I've entitled Emancipation, Dehumanization, and Capital Autonomization, builds pretty directly from my podcast with Nick Land, actually, because in that podcast, there were certain points that we were able to somewhat agree on, but they were kind of surprising and a little bit confusing. But because they were, I thought, quite kind of rich and profitable points of agreement that I wasn't necessarily expecting to emerge in that way, they really kind of stuck with me as something I wanted to spend more time on, trying to fully understand and excavate. And so that's kind of going to be the explicit or kind of proximal cause of the ideas I'm going to try to elaborate throughout this talk. And in fact, in the first, some of the first few slides, I'll kind of go over what Nick and I talked about that gave me some ideas for this talk, the ideas I'm going to try to elaborate over the course of this talk. Oh, hang on. All right, so if I hooked up this right, check it out. Nice. So here's just a little bit of a roadmap. This is the kind of typical, somewhat academic style. I'll kind of start off by trying to sketch the puzzle, the question. Oh, I hear my wife. I hope I didn't wake her up. The puzzle that I'm going to try to kind of address. And then I will sketch a possible answer to that puzzle. I'll kind of go over some of the implications of that answer, and then I want to pause to kind of apply the hypothesis or hypotheses that I elaborate in this talk on some empirical data, I guess you could think of it as a kind of case study. It won't be so formal as that, but I'd like to see if the ideas that I develop in the first half of the talk, I want to see if they maybe give us some traction to explain some of the puzzling phenomena that we see specifically around economic developments right now and kind of their political interpretation. So specifically, I'll be talking about the sharing or the gig economy, because these are, I think, really rich and interesting phenomena, obviously, but also I think the political response and the political interpretation of them has been quite fascinating. And if I'm right, if the model or the the ideas I'm going to try to lay out here today are at all useful or correct, then I think they're going to give us some purchase, specifically on some of the more confusing and fascinating and admittedly quite problematic aspects of the sharing economy, or what is also called the gig economy. You know what I have in mind. So you think of Airbnb, Uber, Deliveroo, all of these kinds of new forms of work in which, what they mostly all have in common is they are kind of creeping increasingly into our private lives and our private spheres. They're often associated with precarious work of various kinds. What they all have in common is, very, very minor guarantees with respect to kind of labor protections. And then you, as a worker anyway, what you supposedly gain is, some flexibility and freedom. So yeah, there's a whole slew of these types of platforms or sectors, if you will, sectors in the economy. And yeah, they all share a few features, and they all also have been evoking, in particular, a lot of kind of, I would say, quite anti-accelerationist, kind of leftist responses. And I think the kind of leftist response to these things is, on the one hand, it's quite understandable because it's kind of in line with the history of trade unionism. It's a kind of typical protest to, precarious working conditions. But on the other hand, the kind of leftist protest mold makes less and less sense, I think, in response to these developments. And in large part, I think that's in large part because these developments are they're generally so much obviously better than their predecessor that protesting them often just looks like bafflingly stupid. So I think there are some puzzles there that, it's quite puzzling if you look at it from a kind of conventional perspective. But I think maybe the ideas I'm going to try to sketch in the first half of this talk give us a kind of key, or a kind of translation key, or even something like a cypher maybe, to make a lot of contemporary kind of political hysteria seem a lot more, it helps us, it might help us make sense of it, or at least that's what I'm trying to do. So, I should also say that this lecture is not going to, this is not like a really well developed or proven, idea that I have. It's a collection of kind of related observations and hypotheses. And I think there's definitely something here, but I'll be kind of trying to figure it out as I go. I've kind of just pieced together some ideas and some data in the loose sense of just information, and I'll try to figure these things out as we go. So I'll be thinking and talking about these things more over the next few weeks probably. So, this is just to kind of get the ball rolling. And if people have comments or observations or whatever, of course, always, put them in the chat or send them to me if you feel like it or whatever. All right, so that's the plan. Nice. So here's just the little selection from my talk with Nick about these ideas, really. And well, the idea that I'm going to present here, I didn't have it before this talk, but in my conversation with him, certain kinds of conceptual relationships emerged through our kind of verbal negotiations, through our effort by he and I to try to find some common ground. A certain set of equivalences emerged that are quite surprising, I think, but quite rich if we think about them. And so here I've kind of selected or extracted the two main examples I have in mind. So this is Nick speaking. He says that the language of emancipation, he says it's fine with him. The only question is what is being emancipated. And he'll say emancipation is a great word as long as by emancipation you mean capital autonomization. And then much later in the podcast, he says, I'm sort of drifting close to agreement with you if by true emancipation you mean something that corresponds strictly to a process of dehumanization. Okay, so in these two parts of our conversation, a certain set of equivalences emerged that I never really thought of, and I don't think many people have really thought of this possible equivalence because it's quite strange, right? It almost seems like a contradiction in terms. Someone in the chat, by the way, is asking if I actually don't know how to pronounce your name. Is it Gujan? But Mr. Erickson is asking if he can call in, and right now there's no call in because I need to stay focused. It would be too hard to manage multiple voices or whatever. But I'll think about doing that in the future. So this is a strange kind of equation here. Emancipation, capital autonomization, and dehumanization. Most people would think that emancipation and dehumanization are arguably antonyms, right? Certainly to the average person who's interested in politics, the idea that these could possibly somehow be the same thing, it's hard to parse. So, and capital autonomization, we'll have to talk about a little bit about, I think, even what that implies. But anyway, this is kind of the motivating puzzle. So this is very fascinating because another reason why it's fascinating is because it came up in the context of me asking Nick about his earlier writings, because he used to think that, his perspective used to have a kind of radical left flavor. And a lot of his earlier texts and all of the CCRU texts are very fascinating and attractive to me, and I think to other people, in large part because they have this kind of heady, kind of emancipatory flavor to them. And so I was trying to figure out, is there a continuity between that former perspective of his and his current one? And because I suspect that there is. Obviously, that's kind of the hunch that I've had. There's something about the kind of contemporary neo-reactionary posture that has something strangely in common, I think, with a certain revolutionary left-wing perspective, but only if we understand both of these two sides of the coin in the proper way. And so for me personally, the way that kind of comes through to me, and the reason I'm interested in spelling this out is because it is increasingly obvious to me that what passes for leftism today, overwhelmingly like what is visible as leftism, is basically inconsistent with actual flourishing of free human beings. And so, that's just so baffling. Like, how can that be? And if you're actually interested in the flourishing of human beings freely, then in a strange way today, you're more and more kind of like opposed to the left, I think. And so, right. So that's kind of the background that this is why I'm trying to kind of come to a perspective that can somehow make sense of these things. And I think the reason why it's so hard to make sense of these things is because in a kind of culture war situation, such as the one that we live in right now, everything, absolutely everything, gets kind of filtered through these two opposing worldviews. They're completely opposing, reality forks, to use a phrase I've used before. And so at a certain point when everything is kind of radically filtered from the get-go, but between these two like radically different filters, it leads to a situation in which, you can just get, if you're trying to kind of find a true perspective, kind of above and beyond whatever like provincial biases, it gets incredibly difficult, and one needs to kind of develop some sort of like it's like you have to speak your own language. You have to kind of develop your own language to have any kind of solid ground if your desire is to not be kind of sucked into the sociological vortex of either like a kind of left wing or a right wing bias to your entire worldview. So that's, again, I'm just kind of fleshing out the motivation here or whatever. Oh, did I misunderstand you in the chat? Oh, someone asked, Mr. Erickson asked, can you call me Murph? Yeah, people can call me Murph. I don't care. It's a common nickname for people named Murphy. I don't mind. If people want to call me what you want, whatever. I don't really care. All right. So, moving on. If you kind of break down this equation that emerged in my conversation with Nick, then I want to argue two things about it. One is that it's a circuit, or it helps to explain certain kinds of circuitous phenomena, especially in kind of contemporary ideological politics. There's a popular kind of idea of horseshoe dynamics in ideology, and I'm not sure that the horseshoe model makes a lot of sense, but I do know that we do constantly, it does constantly seem or feel like, in weird ways, ideology is this kind of thing that if you push too hard in one direction, you have a weird tendency to look like or kind of sound like or take on certain properties of the opposite side. And so I think the fact that these three words, in some sense, can be said to be equivalent, if we can make sense out of why, if we can make sense out of how it's possible for these three very different phrases to, in some sense, be equivalents, I think that might give us some traction on understanding the weird circuits, the strange loops, if you will, that characterized, a lot of contemporary ideological phenomena. So that's one kind of sub-hypothesis here, that I think this will help us lay bare a certain kind of circuit-like structure. And the second is that I wonder if this is not a kind of cipher. And what I mean by cipher is like a translation key, basically. In other words, I wonder if it's possible that the left and the right basically see the same thing, but they have these two mutually exclusive vocabulary systems for describing what is basically the same thing, and they basically just have different normative charges. So in some sense, they might have the same empirical model of the world, but they have these fundamentally different vocabularies. And I wonder if it's possible to develop a kind of translation key between the two. So you could possibly, if I'm right, if there's something about this kind of alignment of words that is true, then it might give us the basis for developing a more sophisticated cipher in which anything that someone says in a left-wing register could be translated into a right-wing register. And that maybe in other words, what the left and the right are saying and doing and wanting are not, they're not as incommensurable as they might seem. Right now, it looks and it feels like the left and the right are just in fundamentally different worlds, and they see things so differently that communication is not even possible. And I wonder if one could possibly develop a kind of cipher that would translate one into the other and therefore make communication possible. I mean, I should make clear that I'm not coming at this with any kind of centrist ambitions. Like I'm not that type of person. Like I have no personal interest in uniting the left and the right or something like that. I mean, I would generally like to avert civil war for sure. I do hope that things don't get violent at all for obvious reasons, but some sort of project relating to, building harmony between the left and the right. I mean, I think that kind of posture is just preposterous for the most part. I just don't see any way that happens. But I mean, if you have a plausible way of doing that, I'm not necessarily against trying, but that's certainly not what I'm investing my efforts in, because I don't see that as possible or likely. And personally, I guess I don't see it as too desirable. I guess I'm interested in navigating peaceful exit dynamics in which everyone is equally kind of looked after and cared for and happy and flourishing in their own way, but in whatever way they please, in kind of centrifugal dynamics. But that's just I'm just sharing my kind of preliminary, or how should I say, I'm just sharing my a little bit more about my motivation here, because I'm going to be talking about how to kind of translate the left and the right in some sense. I think that's what this offers us, but that's not necessarily to harmonize them. It's more to understand. It's more to get an accurate and true grasp of what's really going on in the left and the right. That's not itself a function of a left-wing bias or a right-wing bias. That's ultimately what I'm interested in. Okay, so that's what I mean by circuit and a cipher. So to show you what I mean, I'm going to give you a bunch of different statements, basically. And what's strange about these statements is they're all very different, but they all are more or less true because of this equation. So one of the problems with this equation, that emancipation equals capital autonomization equals dehumanization, is that this permits a wild variety of different syllogisms, if you will, that have very different normative charges. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you a few of the ways that you can arrange this equation. And each of these ways basically reflects one kind of popular perception of an ideological position. So, for instance, if you think that leftism is good, then that equation can give you a perfectly compelling kind of syllogism about why leftism is good. So, for instance, because capital autonomy means dehumanization, well, leftists want to stop capital, so therefore leftism is stopping dehumanization. Sounds great. In that syllogism, which is true according to the equation that we started off with, then leftism is great. It's just trying to stop dehumanization. And I think that's how a lot of leftists see it. So I think a lot of leftists would identify with this. But obviously not everyone would identify with this, and people could debate this. But all I'm saying is it's kind of baked into the equation, and it does characterize one subset of kind of political and ideological actors. Okay. But you can just as well, with the same equation, show that leftism is bad if you apply a slightly different normative charge to it. So here, because capital autonomy is emancipation, then if leftists want to stop capital, then leftists are essentially stopping emancipation. And this is, I think, roughly how right accelerationists might see it, or kind of like radical techno-commercialists might see it this way. Here, leftists are mostly just a bunch of people who want to stop the real engines of progress, which is techno-capital developing increasingly powerful solutions to all kinds of problems and disrupting legacy, market leaders or whatever. So this is a common perspective, and the equation explains, why people might think this way. The idea that rightism is good also flows easily from this equation. So if you think that capital autonomy is emancipation, then rightism, this is basically just the other side of leftism is bad, right? Then rightism is promoting capital autonomy, which means it's promoting emancipation. So this is kind of like good old-fashioned bourgeois capitalist values. This is right. This is kind of Benjamin Franklin, the traditional shopkeeper kind of attitude, right? That capitalism, market freedoms, it's really just giving people the freedom that they need to develop, to create value. And so promoting free markets, for instance, is really just allowing individuals to thrive and to do what's best for them and their family and to create value freely. Again, this is a common perception or structure of thought within the subset of the population. But then you can also say that rightism is kind of the definition of evil, because if capital autonomy is dehumanization, then kind of reactionary politics or rightism, if it means promoting capital autonomy, then it also means promoting dehumanization. And so this is the kind of position that Nick Land, I think, kind of actively and performatively, I would say almost hyperbolically, kind of dramatizes, to the point of explicitly, promoting things like dehumanization. It sounds really bad, right? To many people's viewpoints, it sounds like the definition of evil. But what we see from all of these slides is that if this equation is basically accurate, if it describes something accurate and objective, then the evilness of this kind of neo-reactionary position, yes to dehumanization, yes to capital autonomy, it's actually translatable into all of these other positions, including leftism is good. So what this little exercise shows, the reason I've sketched this out, is because I think it shows that this equation, it gives us a very simplified, concrete kind of statement that accounts for a variety of common viewpoints. And the only thing that these different viewpoints have, the only thing that distinguishes them really is their sort of affective or normative, or you might even think of it as aesthetic charge. Whether it depends on what you think is good or bad, like what you like the most, what you want to emphasize the most. If you want to emphasize promoting dehumanization or promoting emancipation, if you want to fancy yourself as someone who promotes emancipation, or whatever, the only thing that really distinguishes these different translations of this one base equation is the normative add-ons, basically. Okay, whatever you want to emphasize in terms of what sounds good or bad. And so I guess my theory from here would be that this gives a kind of very open-ended framework for all different types of subsets of the population to basically sketch their own take with their own kind of affective and aesthetic charge, depending on their own kind of psychological and sociological factors, really. And so that's a hypothesis. I'm not sure if this is true, but it's conceivable. And I think at the very least, I think this mapping, at least for me in my own mind, it kind of helps to just reduce the complexity of the variety of different ideologies that exist in the sense that, like, if you ask people on the left what's going on with the gig economy or something like that, what's it all about? How do you interpret it? They might give you this kind of big Marxist narrative or whatever. But if I'm right, the underlying structure of what's being labeled good and what's being labeled bad and how it's being framed might boil down to something like that I've developed here. It might not, but it's a hypothesis. You can think of this as a hypothesis to around what statisticians or applied social scientists might call dimensionality reduction. I'm looking for a really sleek, very simplistic kind of set of dimensions that can reduce or cut through a whole bunch of other dimensions in a way that is, yes, it's going to have some error. It's going to omit a lot of important information, but it's going to kind of do the trick in a way that is good enough to give you a grasp on what's going on. So I don't know if this will turn out to be useful. I really don't know. I developed it over the course of the past few days, just kind of thinking about it. But it seems like it might do something. So we'll see. Maybe we'll see in part by thinking about it and talking about it in the following slides. And one way that it might produce some sort of upshot, or at least for me, it produced an upshot in thinking these things through, is that because of this ambivalence, the way that you can kind of turn this one equation into all of these different variations with different affective charges, what that means to me is that we need, perhaps, if what we really want is superior concepts that are less vulnerable to bias on the left and the right, then it seems to me that what we would want is something that can kind of convey, something that can accurately capture the fact that both the left and the right, in some sense, whether they like it or not, they're kind of they're taking on board a certain amount of good and bad, whether they like it or not. I think that's kind of what this equation is helping to teach me. And so, for instance, one way you might go about summarizing the left and the right in a way that's useful for these purposes is you want to think of something that's purposely ambivalent, that kind of sounds good and kind of sounds bad also, if you want to clear yourself from bias. And so it seems to me that one way to do that, for instance, is to say that leftist organizations are protection rackets, and reactionaries want to destroy protection rackets. So the reason I think this is kind of clever and somewhat possibly useful is that protection racket, it's kind of good and it's kind of bad. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe that's what we need. So let me kind of unpack this for you a little bit. Basically, most of you probably know what a protection racket is, but maybe some of you don't. So I'll just briefly spell it out. A protection racket is, think of like the mafia, right? It's often arises in contexts where the state or the police are quite weak. And, if you need someone to protect you and your family, but you don't have the weapons and organization and firepower to protect yourself, maybe there are marauding bands and you need your family and your house or whatever it might be, your community protected. A protection racket is the name for what might arise as some sort of service that is offered to you in exchange for money. So it might be a mafia, it might be whoever, it might be any type of group, but basically they'll say to you, give me a certain amount of money and we'll make sure that no one hurts you. It's basically a kind of private protection service. And so what's interesting about protection rackets is that they're kind of good, right? Because if you are threatened and you need protection, then protection, that's valuable. A protection racket is giving you something that's ethically very good, that has a positive normative charge, that has a positive affective charge. If you don't have anyone to protect you and someone's going to hurt you, then a protection racket it's delivering to you vital, necessary, and good service that you need, right? But the racket part of protection racket hints that, this is not all good, that a protection racket, the reason it's not all good is because if you're paying someone to protect you, that basically means that they have sovereignty over you in some sense. and the same thing that makes it good kind of makes it bad because they can just extort you for more money, basically. I was reading about it I was doing a little bit of research, just like Wikipedia or whatever today, and there's a funny line about how in practice, it said something like, I think the Wikipedia page says, in practice, protection rackets are indistinguishable from extortion rackets. And so you get the problem there. If I'm protecting you and I'm your lifeline, I can just say every month, I can say, give me a little bit more, give me a little bit more, or else I'll kill you, or I'll let in, I'll let in the bad guys. I'll feed you to the wolves. So, okay. I like that. I like the idea of the left as specifically kind of leftist activists. I'm not talking about individuals with just left-leaning temperaments. I'm talking about left-wing activists, left-wing organizations. To the degree the left is a kind of mobilized force, it's a protection racket. And so, it's probably easiest to think about like the Democratic Party in the United States, for instance. What is the Democratic Party's basic relationship to the poor and working people of the United States? It's basically, give me your votes and give me your money, and we'll protect you, right? So that's the idea of thinking about the left as a protection racket. And the reason that's useful is because it kind of conveys, I think accurately, the good and the bad possible ways of interpreting this basic structure. So a protection racket is good because it stops dehumanization. It protects the people from the forces of capital or whatever. And it's also bad because it becomes its own kind of arbitrary, tyrannical police force. So the same thing that stops dehumanization also stops emancipation. I like the way the term protection racket basically has that kind of normative or affective ambivalence of combining something that sounds good with something also that's bad. So that seems promising to me as a way to think about it. Reactionaries can be thought of, on the other hand, as wanting to destroy protection rackets. And so basically this has the same ambivalence as the concept of the protection racket. It's just inverted. So if you want to destroy protection rackets, this is also just a combination of good and bad. You want to take out the guy who's holding someone hostage, right? That's the good part. But on the other hand, on some level, it also looks like, and it is legitimately the case, that you want to destroy people's protection. And so I think this makes a lot of sense. And I think that this concept of protection rackets versus destroying protection rackets, what is, I think, especially attractive about it is that it seems, or at least it feels, unbiased. It seems to kind of do justice to what the left is trying to do in a way that is sensitive to its own terms. And also, it seems to convey what the kind of reactionary project wants to do in a way that is sensitive to its own terms. So, I mean, I wonder if, for instance, if you could get some left-wing people to possibly agree with this and some reactionaries to agree with this also, it might be the basis for some really interesting and productive further discoveries. So we got Michael James in the chat, who I know and respect. So I want to pause to look at this real quick. Not that I don't respect like other people, but just it's jumping out at me. So I'm going to read this. Michael James says that it's disingenuous. Civil law is what is supposed to make police less a racket and more a common good. I don't see how that's disingenuous of me, though. Oh, okay. So up he says, these rackets are different than mafia because of supposedly ambivalent concepts. Maybe I don't understand it exactly, Michael. If you want to clarify and maybe maybe give me like a more specific pointed question or comment that I could maybe more easily respond to off the cuff, please do, and I'll have a look. So, right. So I think that so just carrying on, I think that this makes some sense. And so the question is, can we apply it, or is this useful in any way? What is the conceptual or empirical upshot or purchase that this provides us, if in fact it's true? Ideally, you want to test all theories, and so this is not going to be a test exactly, but at the very least, you can kind of do some preliminary exercises of trying to take any kind of conceptual innovation and just kind of run it through some information about the world and see if it helps us kind of illuminate things, or if it doesn't help us illuminate things. So it's not a test exactly, but more like a possible illustration. And so I started thinking about the sharing economy. Think of businesses such as Airbnb and Uber, in part because of a patron who wrote to me about this and raised some interesting questions and urged me to do this video. So that was why I started thinking about the topics I just presented, and because I do think that they're a possible inroad to understanding quite vexing phenomena in kind of the contemporary economy. So, okay, here's Michael. Let me see, and then I'll return to that. So Michael James says, protection racket is a loaded term that biases towards a negative view of that system. Civil law governs policing, whereas a racket has no basis in the law, which is ambivalent to power. Okay. I mean, I think the police are also just a protection racket. They're just the biggest one, is what I would say. Maybe I can think of a better one. Maybe you can think of a better one. But I think protection racket is kind of fair, because if you need protection and you don't have any other form of protection, then a protection racket is a good thing. Like you need to have one. It can save your life or whatever. So that's me trying to give. I think that's what the left wants to do, right? So I don't know. I'll think about it. But I'm not sure. I feel like the police and the civil law is basically just the documentation written by the most dominant protection racket. So, I think you see this especially clearly in situations where state power is being challenged. So, like, if you look at like the Mexican drug cartels, for instance, the conflict going on in Mexico kind of shows that the state and the drug cartels are, they're just firms competing to be the biggest protection cartel, the biggest protection racket. But right now in Mexico, like, you better have one of those two protecting you. Which one is the quote unquote right one or the best one? That's a kind of meaningless moral question that disappears, I think, depending on where you live and who you are. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. That I think it's very relative, and in any situation, everyone needs a protection racket, so it's a good thing, and ultimately quite a terrible thing also. But we can pick this up later. I'll have to think about it. So, right, the sharing economy, and also known as the gig economy. These are kind of, I guess, somewhat separate things, but I think they're very related. So, Airbnb, it's kind of like everyone is sharing their homes, yay, harmony. But also, if you look at something like Deliveroo and these sorts of things, it's like people working for really short-term gigs in kind of no contract or weak contract environments. Okay, and so what does this have to do with what I've just been laying out? Well, what it has to do with the ideas I just advanced is that the sharing economy and all of these kinds of new forms of economic relationships that characterize a lot of the kind of biggest and most successful companies right now. They have been producing very kind of strange, I think, very, very strange protest behavior, basically. So what do I have in mind? For instance, if you think about right now in the UK, for instance, there's a major campaign by Deliveroo workers. Do they have Deliveroo everywhere? I'm not sure. It's basically people who ride their bikes to deliver food, basically. And it's all run through an app, basically. So you just have an app on your phone and you get ordered to go pick up food here, then go bring it to this person's house or whatever. And it's very flexible hours, whatever. But obviously, it's not exactly famous for its, pensions and benefits. So yeah, very weak labor protections, basically. And so the Deliveroo people are organized, they're trying to organize a union, and they're trying to make a bunch of demands like minimum wage or it's like some minimum amount of payment and stuff like that, whatever, the routine. And so that's kind of interesting. And then also the Airbnb, there's always a kind of common left-wing kind of reaction to things like Airbnb. The critique often is that it is, one popular kind of left-wing critique of all of this sort of stuff is that it's increasingly kind of colonizing, our private lives. I would say that that's kind of the overarching, most common kind of educated, kind of critical perspective on the sharing economy and the gig economy, that it's entering into our homes, and now everyone's person is a business. Your home is a business. If you drive a car, you can be an Uber driver, and so therefore your car is now a business. And this kind of constant creeping of capital and capitalism into our private lives, into our subjectivity, and into our private spaces. That, I would say, apart from the kind of explicit public political protests that you see from whatever, like the Deliveroo workers, I would say this kind of larger cultural discomfort and protest is by far the kind of more dominant and common one in the actual minds of many people, often kind of left-leaning people. So the reason that I find that interesting is because something else that these businesses mostly all have in common is, as far as I can see, maybe people might disagree with this, but as far as I can see, they tend to be pretty undeniably awesome, like way better than the previous predecessor that they're destroying. So, if you compare Airbnb to traditional hotels, for instance, I mean, it seems like an absolute no-brainer in every possible way for the consumer and the producer that Airbnb is way better than the hotel industry. It's cheaper, it's easier, way more options. The experience is arguably more fun. I mean, hotels are nice, but I mean, look, there's a reason why these things take off like wildfire. Ever since Airbnb got their kind of model sorted, you look at the graphs on these things, it's through the roof. These things take off like wildfire, in large part because the benefits that they provide relative to the predecessor, it's just too good to deny. People can't deny it. And yet, at the same time, people criticize it and have these kinds of often quite leftist, anti-accelerationist misgivings about often having to do with, again, often having to do with dehumanization. It's dehumanizing our private spaces and things of this nature. And yet it's like undeniably better in most ways. For consumers and producers, by the way, like I know a lot of people who are not rich people and who like otherwise would be like quite struggling, making like significantly better money in their life because they have a room that they can spare every now and then. So it's like, yeah, on both sides, consumer and producer, these like new lean kind of often, digitally driven, tech driven startups that just decimate these traditional models. They usually do so by just being objectively better in many, many ways. And people love them and sign up for them rapidly en masse. And then we also kind of like talk about how we don't like them and how they dehumanize and how it's capitalism and colonizing our subjectivity and all this kind of stuff. And so what I'm getting at here is that the kind of conceptual exercise, if you will, that we conducted in the first half of this talk, I think really helps to explain this, right? I think it's because we have this ambivalence towards something like Airbnb precisely because there is this kind of deep ambivalence built into the process of capital autonomization. It is kind of dehumanizing, and it's also what we truly desire the most. That's not a convenient conclusion, but the conceptual equation that I laid out at the beginning of this talk, it does make sense of it, actually. And so I don't know if this is the final conclusion, but I have a few other things to say. And as I said, this is a freewheeling kind of exploration. I don't know where it's going exactly, but maybe part of the reason why there's so much kind of ideological and conceptual chaos is perhaps because there is, on some level, deep ambivalence in the structure of things themselves, maybe. There's this ambivalence in kind of baked into reality in some sense that what we most long for as human beings, like what we truly desire, is perhaps strictly equivalent to that which is hollowing us out. And so depending on your temperament and depending on who you hang out with, you can choose to see that in a positive light, or you can choose to see that in a sad and negative light. I'm not giving you some bullshit about how, the power of positive thinking and therefore everyone just have a positive attitude towards this and everything's going to be okay. It's not that at all. But my point is that the structure of reality, and especially kind of capital acceleration, might simply have deeply positive and deeply negative implications in terms of our normative and affective registers. But that might be because of something about, I don't know, maybe it's something about who we are, maybe it's something about what human beings are composed of. Freud wrote a lot about, the ambivalence, right? So, yeah, about how love often involves hate and hate often involves love. It could be something like that. I'm not sure. It could have something more to do with the structure of techno-capital or something like that. Those are things we might think about in the future. But anyway, I have some other slides still. If you look at the growth of Airbnb, this is an interesting graph. You can see, obviously, like all of these major, big, successful startups, they kind of, after a few false starts, they kind of eventually they take off like wildfire, and it's kind of exponential curve. What's interesting about the case of Airbnb, I was reading about it just the other day, is that there was a turning point, or at least one kind of journalist that I was reading says that, or argues that there was a turning point in the takeoff of Airbnb, which was when they introduced a photography program. So this is kind of interesting for thinking about the relationship between kind of human subjectivity and the kind of current machinations of techno-capital. Because basically the problem that Airbnb was having at first was that people didn't want to stay in other people's houses, because when you think of other people's houses, you think that's gross, right? Like if you have, before Airbnb, like if you go to someone's house for the first time, it kind of smells a little bit different, right? They who knows how they organize their stuff and whatever, like you don't know what you're getting. And so there's always this risk that it's going to be ugly, it's going to be smelly, it's going to be dirty, whatever. At least that fear was one of the things that I think was blocking the takeoff of Airbnb in its earliest stages. And so they're very clever. Like a lot of these tech startups, it's just a small number of people kind of hacking in their room or whatever. And so they have the agility to kind of like try random experimental solutions to things. And so they what they did was they unrolled a photography program where basically they would offer you professional photography. I think they would give it for free to like they tested it on some of the hosts on Airbnb. Say we'll come out, we'll take fancy professional photographs and make your place look really nice, And apparently, at least this one journalist believes that that was a key kind of turning point for the rise and success of Airbnb. It was after the photography program that it really took off. And this is actually, I think, a pretty illuminating little data point, because what it highlights for us is the way in which right now, kind of one of the major frontiers of techno capital is kind of excavating the shreds of value that that are located primarily in our own kind of private, emotional, aesthetic offerings, basically. And so it's the same, like YouTube is a very similar example, right? Like one of the reasons why YouTube is replacing contemporary media, one of the reasons, for instance, you people are watching me right now when you could just as well be watching, either cable TV or, whatever else, or movies on Netflix. One of the reasons that you're watching me even instead of Netflix, even though Netflix is equally available to you with the press of a button, is because I'm showing you me. I'm here live. Like there is something just to all humans, there is something attractive and valuable about people showing what is real and offering the best kind of traces of value that is hiding kind of inside of their emotions, inside of their mind, in their speech. I'm essentially giving this to you right now in the same way that Airbnb hosts give that to their guests or whatever. And it's the same exact reason why these two, the same exact reason explains why these two platforms are kind of dominant representative platforms for our current historical moment. And the way to understand that, I think, is that one of the frontiers that has not quite been fully exploited yet is the value that lies hidden in each and every one of us, if you will, that unique human value. And so one of the framework that I kind of introduced at the beginning is really kind of useful here because, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Well, it's kind of both. And doesn't that explain quite well why our kind of cultural and political responses to these phenomena are so schizophrenic? I think it makes sense of that. If you're renting out a room on Airbnb, is that like a really attractive, useful way for you to have more freedom from your perhaps more exploitative traditional job? Maybe that sounds like pretty emancipatory. Like if someone can, for instance, like escape a 9-to-5 bullshit job by renting out one of their rooms on Airbnb, at least for that person, it's a pretty unambiguous case of an emancipatory outcome, right? I would think, on average, at least. Of course, you are kind of opening your home up to strangers, and you are kind of turning your home into a kind of commercial process in some sense. But you have to trade that off against the time and energy that you are no longer giving away to like a traditional business or whatever, a traditional employer. I'm inclined to think that there's a net gain of emancipation there. If you think of emancipation as kind of the sum total of exploitation that you suffer or whatever, or perhaps just free time and energy. And take me, for example. Like, I mean, I'm a kind of interesting example because only for the reason that I can speak to my own case and I have data about my own experience anyway. Like right now, like Am I whoring out my office room and kind of uh, auto exploiting myself more ruthlessly than ever? Or am I actually, you know, building an escape route from the truly exploitative reality of my more conventional brick and mortar academic lifestyle? I mean, I think what my perspective that I've developed here today kind of is helping me figure out is that it would be better to have an honest ambivalence than to have a kind of confused and chaotic schizophrenic attitude towards it all. I think that's one thing that I'm kind of thinking right now, because I would rather kind of have a stable and accurate viewpoint, if it is in fact accurate. Time will tell, I'm not sure. But I would rather have the stable and accurate viewpoint that right now, for instance, I am both dehumanizing myself by essentially selling deeper and deeper parts of my soul to the internet, while I'm also escaping the previous form of exploitation and kind of dehumanization that was being a kind of traditional academic. Like maybe it's just both. Maybe techno capital or capital autonomization is essentially a process of emancipation, but you only get emancipation by dehumanizing yourself to some degree. Maybe, I don't know. And it's worth remembering or kind of recalling that capital autonomization is what's going on at the bottom of this, or you can put whatever term you want at the bottom, the so-called bottom, but in some sense dehumanization has a clearly negative charge and emancipation has a clearly positive charge. But capital autonomization, to its credit as a phrase or term, it's a little bit more neutral. It obviously is not totally neutral depending on how you see it, but for instance, like Airbnb, for instance, is capital working through the homes of people, right? So before Airbnb, you might have to the home was a place where people kind of reproduce themselves, and it was a private place where you kind of recovered from your commercial work, from the factory or coal mine or whatever corporate campus you go to on a daily basis. But whereas in the past, capital kind of relied on us to take care of ourselves and then go serve capital. Now capital is simply coming to us where we live, and it's increasing its web of functioning through more and more private spaces. Basically, it's expanding its web. It's expanding the sum total of nodes and the depth of those nodes in kind of the social sphere, and those it's reaching deeper and deeper and down into what was once private spaces, and it's basically doing its own work for itself, but through us. And so, this is how we survive, right? We make these bargains with capital. We allow it to exploit our souls deeper and deeper. We allow it into our private spaces deeper and deeper. But by doing that, we get what we want in some sense. And maybe what we want is wrong. Maybe what we want, maybe that is the problem. Maybe it is the nature of our desires that is the source of evil, and why we are perhaps now we are experiencing a kind of retribution for having evil in the depths of our desires, perhaps. That's one way to understand this. I don't know. Right. In any event, like right now, YouTube is making money through my home. I've opened up my home and my heart and soul so that YouTube could make money. And maybe that's dehumanizing of me. Maybe that's maybe that's bad, that capital is becoming autonomous through me. Oh, but the other thing, just another side point, what another reason why capital autonomization is ambivalent is that how exactly does capital autonomize? This is an interesting question. Nick likes to use the word capital autonomization phrase. A lot of people like to use it nowadays, I think. It's kind of a fashionable theory word right now, but not a lot of people take the time to kind of spell it out. Like, how exactly does capital become automatic or autonomous? How can it run itself? And I had a little bit of an insight into that today, thinking about everything I'm talking about right now, and it's something like the following. Capitalism or capital autonomizes by latching itself onto things that we would do anyway. And that's why it's autonomous, or that's why it's automatic in some sense. So like once upon a time, for capital to run, for capital to churn, humans would have to like go very far out of their way to do very strange things, right? Like there was nothing more unnatural to human beings than going into factories. It was from the beginning seen as insane, evil, terrible, highly undesirable, and unnatural. Famously, in all of the literature at the time. And that's like the opposite of capital being autonomous. Obviously, relative to previously, it's more autonomous. But compared to what we have now, in retrospect, it seems very far from autonomous. And why is that? It's because we had to do so much to make it work. We had to go so far out of our normal pathways of what we would do anyway to make it work. But one of the ways that a capital is becoming autonomous is because for it to function, all we need to do is what we would have done anyway. And that's really interesting. I think that's an interesting way to put it. And again, it really cuts to the heart of the ambivalence that I'm talking about, because like, for instance, right now, like capital is working through the internet. It's working through all kinds of machine learning models. It's working through all kinds of collective intelligence to basically enter into my room right now. Like capital working through YouTube is entering my room right now, and it's excavating my heart and my soul for itself. And what does it need to do that? Well, relatively quite little. It's basically all set up already. All it needs to do is kind of open up its interfaces, open up its membrane, and then I and millions of people like me start doing it for itself automatically. And why is that? It's because this is actually what I want to do. That's what's so strange about it. Like, this is the most unmediated, free intellectual production I've ever been able to do. It's some of the best, coolest stuff. I've loved YouTube. I've really loved doing this ever since I started doing it seriously. It's been, on the whole, nothing but fun and interesting and stimulating and exciting and emancipating. I have 100% found YouTube to be, on the whole, very emancipating on net. Even though, in the same breath, I can also affirm that, yeah, this is capital becoming autonomous, operating through my heart and my soul and my house, and it is pressing deeper and deeper into my subjectivity. Is it good? Is it bad on net? I don't know. I guess that'll have to be, I would like to think about these things more, but, you can't bring every conversation to some final maximum powerful conclusion about every possible question. So I think I'm just going to not try overly hard to, make more generic, larger conclusions. I'm just going to lay out what I've already laid out and let it digest. Maybe we'll see if these ideas produce any new insights, see if other people find them useful, see if they have legs or not, and then go back to the drawing board and wonder about whether or not we might be able to come up with some insights about the larger questions. Like obviously the next question you always want to ask, the bigger, more ultimate questions, but you also have to have the discipline to stop yourself and take one thing at a time. So I don't think that I have too much more. I think I have maybe one more slide. Right. So there's this critique of Airbnb that it's racist. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. If you see this kind of fake ad that's kind of making fun of Airbnb, it says belong anywhere unless you are black. Apparently, black people kind of have a hard time on Airbnb. I didn't read too much into it. I don't know the details of the story, but it's not hard to imagine why. On the one hand, there is racism, and a lot of these platforms that connect people and put people in increasingly dense kind of networked relationships, there will be cause for racism. Not cause, but you know what I mean. There will be opportunities for racism. But also, I do think that there's another kind of story going on here, because all of these kinds of current developments in the economy, they are going to bring more and more protests related to racism, sexism. In some sense, the whole Black Lives Matter moment, the whole Me Too moment. You have to wonder if these are not kind of strangely related to the sharing economy and the gig economy, or more broadly, just the digitalization of these legacy markets or institutions in the following way. And again, this is just a hypothesis, it has to be tested, but I think that basically what's going on is that when these new kind of lean digital startups like Airbnb or Uber create these kind of networked platform alternatives to these like legacy institutions, whether it be the hotel industry or the taxi industry or whatever, what happens is that selection effects increase, I think. And selection all of a sudden becomes much more brutal. So it kind of goes back to the point about how the photography that Airbnb introduced was key in its rise. What that's doing in some sense is it's showing you that those houses that look the best are going to be more powerfully selected for. So by kind of introducing these more efficient, lean, digital, networked platforms for entire classes of problems like lodging, what it means is that the experience of lodging and the markets for lodging are going to become more brutal in the judgments that they hand out. And whether those judgments are fair or unfair, or biased or not biased, or racist or not racist, or prejudiced in any other way, that's an empirical question. Who knows? It can, I'm sure, racism will happen. I'm sure sexism will happen. And also, other forms of selection will happen that are not racist and are not sexist, but might be correlated with race or gender, for instance. And that's where things get really, really messy. And this is going to be a terrain of political conflict for the foreseeable future, I think. So, right. I think I don't at the moment. I don't want to go too deep into the sex and gender stuff at the moment. We can talk about that at another time, because I think this larger phenomenon of selection effects, this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, about how I think in general across different sectors, the brutality of selection effects is increasing, and that's affecting different types of people differently. And I think that people with different temperaments are responding differently. And I have a kind of I've been kind of trying to sketch in my own notes like a larger kind of theory about that, and so that's something that we'll definitely return to. But for now, I think even the stuff about gender and sex and these different types of objections that you see to these new kind of economic formations, I think that they also can be understood to some degree within the framework that I've kind of advanced here, which is to say that, yeah, there is a lot that is in fact dehumanizing, and there are going to be more and more examples where some new business, whether advertently or inadvertently, does something that looks racist or is racist or looks sexist or is sexist, and whether it is or is not can be debated later, but you're going to see more and more of that type of problem, which is the dehumanizing part of the equation. But this is the difficult part, precisely because this is that brutality of selection effects is exactly what people want. We want more value to be delivered to us more efficiently, and we want what's not valuable to be more brutally ignored and set aside. Like, that is the definition of what people desire, all people. And so the more capitalism is able to do that, and the more they're able to do that by kind of installing themselves deeper and deeper into our home spaces and our car spaces and our private lives, the more effectively they're going to give people what they want, and the more like painfully they're going to treat the people who and the objects and the entities that other people do not want. And so if you're unwanted by someone for any reason, the effectiveness of that rejection, the brutality of that rejection, is going to be increasingly efficient. And that does present some horrifying prospects, and I think that does raise some genuine and really deep concerns for people who are opposed to racism and opposed to sexism, as I am, for what it's worth. It's just a much more difficult problem than most people are going to want to discuss anywhere in public, for the simple reason that brutality is basically the other side of precisely what we desire. Folks, that's the end of my talk, I think. Thank you very much. If anyone has questions or comments, I guess I can hang around for a minute. I'm always pretty tired after these long talks, but I'm happy to look at the chat and maybe engage for another minute or two if there's anything really good on your minds. Just no huge, big, hard balls. Well, actually, no. If you want to, yeah, go for it. But I might just note them for later and talk about it later, because it's hard after these are done. Geo says that we will have smart appliances that will deny people good because making racist tweets will violate the TOS. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what you mean. Oh, goods. you will have smart appliances that will deny people goods because making racist tweets will violate the TOS. Maybe. Yeah, that's a good question. Like, how is kind of institutionalized political correctness going to enter into this? That's a really good question. It's something we could think about more. Okay, folks, I'm going to call it a night. Thank you very much. And big thanks to my patron who suggested this topic to me and gave me some interesting stimulation for thinking about it. Someone's asking, can you message me? Yeah, sure, of course. Message me. Instagram is not the best place for messaging. I don't check it that much. I don't check the messages anyway because the messages aren't that active. But yeah, sure, why not? You can message me on Instagram. If you want to get into Discord, people, shoot me a message on just DM me on Twitter. I'm happy to let you into Discord. Just gotta ask me. And what else? Yeah, as always, big thanks to my patrons who are inspiring me to really kind of tackle all of this stuff with gusto, and really kind of empowering me to think in a serious way, like how can I take all of this stuff to another level. So big thanks as always. Thanks for the active chat. It was relatively constructive. Oh, and by the way, I saw a few of you said very nice things a few lines back. A few of you, I think, said you enjoyed this and that it was good. So thank you very much for the kind words. I'm glad you enjoyed it. As always, I'm glad to you for hanging out. I'm grateful for, your attention. I'm grateful there are a few people who are interested enough in what I think to hang out with me while I explicate it. If you have any thoughts or comments, feel free to shoot me a message on whatever platform. I'm trying to think what else, if there's any other things I have. Reza Negarastani said he's going to do the live stream soon. He's on Twitter now. Everyone's amused by that. So that should be fun. We're trying to find a date for when, so I'll let you know when, but that should happen. Any other news items? I don't know. It's 4:04 a.m. here. I've been such a madman lately. I haven't seen sunlight in days. Actually, no, I saw it for like an hour or two the other day. But yeah, almost haven't seen any sunlight in a while. Honestly, it's like really rainy. This is like the rainy season of in England. It's just very gray and dark anyway. So in some sense, like, I'm not losing that much by just staying up in the evenings. But yeah, also, as always, make sure you subscribe, like the video, leave a reply if you want. And, something else I might say is if you like these, it'd be really good of you to share them a little bit. Even like if you have a friend or something that is interested in this type of stuff, maybe tell them about my work and tell them to reach out to me or whatever. And that would be cool. I'd appreciate that. Trying to think what else. And the final thing I'll say is just if maybe you have some topic that you want me to think about, or maybe some special request for something that I should make or reflect on or work on, definitely let me know. You're free to just tell me, like, shoot me a DM and let me know or whatever, but definitely if you're a patron, then I will be especially eager to kind of take up whatever suggestions you might have. So if you're really keen to have me talk about something and you want to definitely make it happen, then I would definitely kindly invite you to throw me some money each month, and I'll put your requests to the absolute top of the list for sure. But even if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. And maybe if you have some really good idea, feel free to just shoot me a message on whatever platform you want to shoot me a message on. I'm always open to chatting with people here and there. I just, can't guarantee if I'm going to think about it too much. But yeah, I'm always open to new ideas. Yeah, Nick Serenichek. Maybe I'll see if I can get him to chat. I know he wrote a book about platform capitalism. Again, like I was saying before the other night, I'm just not sure if these like academic types, I'm not sure if they're like willing to talk with me. Like, I'm not sure what my image or reputation is anymore in those circles. I just don't know. I mean, I don't care. In the nicest way possible. I just don't think about it at all. I don't mean that in a dismissive or antagonistic way. But I've just systematically kind of been ignoring and trying to kind of steel myself to anyone's possible, gossip or whatever. I've been trying to really kind of fortify my will and buckle down on what I think and what I believe in, not allow like timid academics or like, insecure bureaucrats, of which there are many. I'm not calling out anyone in particular. I'm just saying the average type of person. I've been kind of fortifying myself against the hesitations and fears and anxieties of the normal person, because I wouldn't be able to do everything I'm doing right now if I didn't do that. And I don't mean to lionize myself or anything like that. What I'm doing is like it should be quite normal. Just going straight to the internet and saying what you think and letting the chips fall where they may. That should not be heroic. It should be what just normal, decent, mature people do. But in today's culture and in today's kind of paranoid, claustrophobic, super politically correct, fearful Western culture, to just do something as simple as say exactly what you think in public is increasingly hard. Oh shit. And so, yeah, the only reason I say that is so I've purposely, therefore, kind of just plugged my ears and put up my blinders around whatever like any like academics might think. So like Nick Saranicek or Helen Hester, like I honestly just don't know if they would think like, dude, I'm not doing your YouTube live stream show because you're an alt-right fascist who platformed Nick Land, or if they would think, oh yeah, it's no big deal. You're a nobody and it doesn't really matter, so I'll talk with you. Or you're a nobody and it doesn't really matter, so no, I won't talk to you. Or, oh yeah, what you're doing is really cool. And yeah, I know it's kind of politically incorrect, but good for you. And I support that and I want to be a part of that too. So I don't know which of those four possible outcomes, like the academic kind of radical left theory people, I don't know how any of them see me. So, and I'm not like really socialized into them. I've met Helen Hester. I think I did meet Nick Saranicek once. And I met Mackenzie Wark once too. But I never got like deep into those circles. Like I was never like a very well socialized, like radical academic. And so that's why I've been slow to ask all of those people to do the live stream. But I would love to talk with any of those types of people. I'm happy to chat with them. It's hard for me to know if people would want to or whatever. And the thing is, like, emailing is, it takes a fair amount of time, and you don't want to email someone if you think there's like not a good chance of them accepting. So, but I think I'll do it. I think I'll ask all those people eventually. I should just get around to doing it. I'm probably just putting it off. Those are all good people who have been recommended to me, and I'd be happy to talk with all of them. But I think I've just been putting it off because it does take time, and if they say no for whatever reason, it's just a waste of time or whatever. But yes, good suggestions. I will invite those people, and I'll let you know. More of my thoughts on Simone Weil. Okay, that'd be fun to talk about. I would love to develop more of my thoughts on Simone Weil. So that's a welcome suggestion. I'll think about that for sure. All right, folks. Thanks again, as always. I think I'm going to stick a fork in it now. Enjoy the rest of your days or evenings, wherever in the world you are, and I will talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.